There's a specific disorienting experience almost everyone who's loved a covert narcissist eventually describes, and it usually comes out sounding something like this. Everyone else in my life sees this quiet, gentle, almost fragile person, someone who seems genuinely humble, genuinely sensitive, sometimes even a little shy. And then, in private, in specific, predictable moments, I encounter someone else entirely, someone cold, someone cutting, someone whose reaction feels wildly disproportionate to whatever small thing just happened. And when I try to describe this second version to anyone who only knows the first, I'm met with genuine disbelief because it simply doesn't match anything they've ever witnessed. This is what we're exploring today, and the question in this title deserves a genuinely honest, precise answer rather than a simple yes or no, because the truth is considerably more nuanced and considerably more useful once properly understood. Does a covert narcissist only show their true self when triggered? The short answer is yes, largely, but understanding exactly why this is true and exactly what triggered actually means in this specific context changes everything about how you interpret both versions of this person and which one actually deserves to be trusted as accurate. Let's start with understanding why covert narcissism specifically produces this particular pattern, because it operates somewhat differently from the more overt, easily recognizable version most people initially picture when they hear the word narcissist. Remember something worth understanding as foundational to this entire distinction. Overt narcissism tends to seek admiration through visible confidence, charisma, and open assertions of superiority. Covert narcissism seeks the exact same underlying validation, the exact same confirmation of significance we've traced throughout this entire series, but through an almost opposite external presentation: humility, sensitivity, self-deprecation, sometimes even visible anxiety or fragility, all of which function, whether consciously or not, as their own particular strategy for extracting attention, sympathy, and reassurance from the people around them. Here's what's worth understanding about why this presentation is genuinely effective at concealing the underlying psychology for considerably longer than overt narcissism typically manages to remain hidden. A visibly grandiose, obviously self-important person tends to trigger suspicion relatively quickly in most observers, because the behavior itself matches what people generally understand narcissism to look like. A quiet, humble, seemingly self-effacing person triggers almost no suspicion at all, because this presentation directly contradicts everything most people associate with narcissistic behavior. This is precisely why covert narcissists so often maintain reputations as gentle, sensitive, even wounded individuals for years, sometimes decades, among people who've never witnessed the private, triggered version at all. Let's talk about what triggered actually means in this specific context, because it's worth defining precisely rather than leaving it vague. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the fragile core underneath all narcissistic defenses, an underlying belief in fundamental insufficiency defended against through whatever strategy has proven most effective at extracting external validation. For covert narcissists specifically, the humble, sensitive presentation functions as an ongoing, carefully maintained defense, one that requires considerable, continuous effort to sustain, precisely because it runs counter to whatever underlying entitlement and need for superiority actually exists beneath it. A trigger, in this context, is any moment where this careful maintenance becomes genuinely difficult to sustain, typically because something has directly threatened the specific narrative this presentation is designed to protect. Here's what these triggers tend to look like in practice, and it's worth understanding them specifically, because they often differ meaningfully from what triggers an overt narcissist's more visible reactions. Being genuinely outperformed or overshadowed, even in relatively minor ways, tends to trigger considerable difficulty, because it directly threatens the quiet superiority this particular presentation is actually protecting underneath its humble exterior. not receiving the specific sympathy or reassurance they've come to expect, particularly after some display of vulnerability or self-deprecation, often produces a surprisingly sharp reaction because this vulnerability was never actually as simple as it appeared, functioning instead as a specific bid for a specific kind of response, and the absence of that expected response registers as genuine deprivation rather than simple, ordinary disappointment. Being genuinely, directly confronted about something they've done, particularly in a way that doesn't allow for the usual retreat into self-deprecating deflection, often produces one of the most severe reactions available, because this specific presentation depends heavily on maintaining the appearance of fragility as a shield against accountability, and direct confrontation threatens to remove that shield entirely, exposing something considerably less sympathetic underneath. Let's talk about a specific common scenario that illustrates this clearly, because it plays out with remarkable consistency across countless relationships with covert narcissists specifically. Picture a moment where a covert narcissist has just been genuinely, visibly outshined in some small, ordinary way, a colleague receiving credit they quietly believed should have been theirs, a friend's achievement being celebrated more enthusiastically than their own recent effort. In front of others, this moment often produces exactly what you'd expect from the gentle, humble presentation, gracious words, perhaps even genuine seeming happiness for the other person's success. But in private, shortly afterward, something considerably different tends to surface, a coldness, a sudden irritability over something entirely unrelated, a subtle but unmistakable withdrawal of warmth that seems to have no obvious connection to what actually happened. This is worth understanding as the trigger response we've been tracing throughout this exploration, and it's worth naming why it emerges specifically in private rather than continuing the public performance into private settings as well. The public performance requires an audience in order to serve its purpose, extracting admiration for their gracious humility. Once that audience is no longer present, the effort required to maintain the performance no longer produces its intended benefit, and what surfaces instead, in the absence of any audience worth performing for, tends to be considerably closer to whatever actually exists underneath, unfiltered by the careful management that public settings otherwise demand. What we haven't yet explored is what this private, triggered version actually reveals about which version of this person deserves to be trusted as more accurate, why the public performance, however consistent and however convincing, should never actually be treated as the real version simply because it's more frequently witnessed, and what this understanding means practically for anyone trying to make sense of the confusing, contradictory experience of loving someone who seems to exist as two entirely different people depending on who happens to be watching. Let's talk directly about which version deserves to be trusted as more accurate, because this question genuinely matters, and the answer runs counter to how most people initially, intuitively want to resolve this confusion. There's a strong, understandable pull toward wanting the public version to be the real one, the gentle, humble, sensitive person everyone else seems to know and appreciate, treating the private, triggered version as some kind of aberration, a bad moment, a temporary lapse that doesn't reflect who this person actually fundamentally is. This pull makes sense because believing in the gentler version is considerably less painful than accepting the alternative. Here's what's worth understanding, though, and it's worth stating with real precision. The triggered version isn't the aberration. It's the baseline, revealed specifically in moments where the effort required to maintain the public performance has, for whatever reason, become momentarily unsustainable. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about performance requiring active, ongoing effort that inherently varies depending on circumstance, audience, and how directly threatened the underlying narrative currently feels. The public presentation isn't more real simply because it's more frequently displayed. It's simply the version that requires more energy to produce, and the private, triggered version is what remains once that particular energy expenditure is no longer being actively sustained. This is worth understanding through a useful analogy, one that clarifies why frequency of display doesn't actually determine authenticity. Consider someone who spends considerable, deliberate effort presenting a specific, curated version of themselves in professional settings, careful, polished, consistently impressive, while a considerably rawer, less controlled version emerges specifically during moments of genuine stress or genuine threat, when maintaining the polished performance simply isn't sustainable anymore. Most people would readily recognize that the stressed, unguarded version reveals something genuinely important about this person's actual character, even though it's displayed considerably less frequently than the carefully maintained professional presentation. The same principle applies here, and it's worth applying it with equal clarity, even though the emotional stakes involved make this considerably harder to accept when the person in question is someone you've loved. Let's talk about why this distinction matters so much practically, because it directly addresses the confusion this exploration's title refers to. If you've spent considerable time wondering which version is actually true, torn between the person everyone else seems to know and the person you privately encounter during trigger moments, this confusion itself has likely produced genuine, ongoing self-doubt, wondering if you're somehow bringing out the worst in them, wondering if the private version is somehow your fault, your own perception distorted or exaggerated, given how consistently different it is from what everyone else seems to experience. Here's what's worth understanding clearly. In order to release this specific confusion, you're not bringing out something that wasn't already there. You're simply, by virtue of proximity and intimacy, positioned to witness moments the broader public performance was never actually designed to survive. This is worth understanding as genuinely important information about your own position in this relationship, not as evidence of your own fault or your own distorted perception. Intimate partners, close family members, people positioned close enough to witness genuine, unguarded moments are simply more likely to encounter the triggered version, precisely because maintaining the careful public performance across every single private interaction, indefinitely, without exception, would require a level of sustained effort that simply isn't realistic for anyone to maintain forever, regardless of how skilled they've become at the performance itself. Let's talk about why this pattern specifically produces such profound isolation for the people closest to a covert narcissist, because this connects directly to something we've traced throughout other explorations in this series regarding isolation more broadly. When you attempt to describe the triggered version to people who've only ever encountered the humble, gentle public presentation, you're often met with genuine disbelief, sometimes even gentle suggestions that you might be misreading the situation, that surely someone this consistently kind and humble couldn't possibly behave the way you're describing. This disbelief, however understandable given what these outside observers have actually witnessed, tends to compound the isolation you're already experiencing, adding genuine confusion about your own perception on top of the original confusion about which version of this person is actually real. This is worth understanding as one of the more insidious features of covert narcissism specifically, considerably more difficult to navigate than the overt version, precisely because the overt narcissist's public and private behavior tend to align considerably more closely, making outside validation of your own experience considerably easier to obtain. The gap between public performance and private reality, so central to covert narcissism specifically, creates a kind of structural isolation that's genuinely difficult to escape without deliberately, actively seeking out people who understand this specific pattern rather than continuing to seek validation from people who've simply never had the particular vantage point required to witness what you've actually experienced. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, the one where we need to address what this understanding actually means practically for how you should interpret and respond to this specific pattern going forward, why the trigger moments themselves, uncomfortable as they are, offer something genuinely valuable that the consistent public performance never could, and what this entire understanding reveals about the deeper structural relationship between performance and authenticity that this exploration's title has been building toward from its very beginning. Let's talk about what this understanding actually means practically for how you should interpret and respond to this specific pattern going forward, because everything we've traced throughout this exploration needs to resolve into something genuinely useful, not simply a more sophisticated way of understanding your own confusion. Here's the first, most practical shift worth making. Stop treating the trigger moments as anomalies requiring explanation, and start treating them as the most reliable data available to you about who this person actually is underneath the performance. This shift matters enormously because so much energy in these relationships tends to go toward exactly the wrong project, trying to understand what caused the trigger, trying to figure out what you did to provoke it, trying to reconcile the cold, cutting version with the gentle version everyone else seems to know, as though reconciliation itself were the goal. The actual, more useful goal is considerably simpler. Recognizing that the trigger moments are showing you something true, and letting that truth genuinely inform how much of yourself you continue investing, rather than continuing to search for ways to prevent triggers from ever occurring again. Let's talk about why the trigger moments offer something genuinely valuable that the consistent public performance never could, because this is worth understanding as more than simply useful information, but as something approaching a genuine gift, uncomfortable as that framing might initially sound. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how difficult it is to make accurate assessments of someone whose presentation remains carefully, consistently curated across every interaction. The public performance, however convincing, however consistently maintained, tells you almost nothing reliable about how this person will actually treat you during genuine difficulty, genuine conflict, genuine moments where their own comfort and your own needs come into direct tension. The trigger moments answer exactly this question, directly and unmistakably, in a way the careful performance was specifically designed to prevent you from ever clearly seeing. This is worth understanding as genuinely protective information, precisely because it removes considerable guesswork from an otherwise deeply confusing situation. Instead of wondering indefinitely what this person is really like underneath everything, you already know directly from lived experience exactly what surfaces when the performance becomes unsustainable. This knowledge, however painful to have acquired, is considerably more valuable than continuing uncertainty would be, because it allows you to make genuinely informed decisions about this relationship, based on accurate reality rather than on the carefully curated version. This psychology has spent considerable effort constructing specifically to prevent this exact clarity from emerging. Let's talk about the deeper structural relationship between performance and authenticity this entire exploration has been building toward, because it's worth stating directly as the core insight tying everything together. Performance by its very nature requires effort, and effort by its very nature cannot be sustained indefinitely, without exception, forever. This means every performance, no matter how skilled, no matter how consistently maintained, will eventually reveal its underlying reality during exactly the moments when maintaining it becomes genuinely difficult. Moments of genuine threat, genuine stress, genuine challenge to whatever the performance was specifically designed to protect. This principle applies considerably beyond covert narcissism specifically, but it applies with particular striking clarity to this specific pattern, precisely because the gap between public presentation and private reality is so pronounced, so consistently different, that the trigger moments end up functioning almost like a controlled experiment, revealing, with remarkable consistency, exactly what exists underneath a presentation specifically designed to obscure it. Here's the deepest insight worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration. You were never wrong about what you witnessed in those private triggered moments, and the gap between what you experienced and what everyone else saw was never evidence of your own distorted perception. It was evidence of your specific proximity, your specific intimacy, positioning you to witness exactly what the public performance was constructed to prevent anyone else from ever seeing clearly. This isn't a burden you were meant to carry alone indefinitely, and it's worth seeking out people who genuinely understand this specific pattern, who won't meet your description of the triggered version with disbelief precisely because their own understanding of covert narcissism includes this exact, well-documented gap between performance and reality. So if you've spent considerable time confused, isolated, wondering which version of this person actually represents who they really are, let this be what you carry forward from everything we've explored today. The gentle, humble version everyone else knows was never actually more true simply because it was more consistently displayed. It was simply more heavily invested in, more carefully maintained, more effortfully produced for an audience whose perception mattered considerably to the underlying narrative being protected. The version you encountered during trigger moments, uncomfortable and disorienting as it was to witness, was the version requiring the least effort to produce, which makes it, by every reasonable measure this exploration has traced, considerably more reliable evidence of who this person actually is, underneath everything the care,